about electricity cost and investment. That is a complex and somehow very sensitive subject, but that is nevertheless crucial to support arbitration in the energy and to allow prospective insight. I'm very honored to introduce our speakers and experts, Mr. Robert Idel, Mr. Suhail Shatila, and Mrs. Torras Ortiz. I hope I didn't misspell your name, so sorry for that if I did. So welcome to all of you. Of course, you will have to introduce myself. I didn't introduce myself. I am Alexandra Bonanni. I'm the head of the Energy Strategy Lab from the Capgemini group. So this is a very, very interesting subject. And I propose to start with you, Mr. Idel, if you want to, and to introduce yourself, and please go on.
All right. Yeah, thanks for giving me the floor. I'm going to start sharing now. I hope you can see my slides. Yeah, thanks for giving me the floor. So I would like to talk about the evaluation of costs of electricity. And the current standard is to evaluate costs according to the so-called levelized cost of electricity. What are levelized costs, or LCOE, as basically the average cost per unit of generated electricity, which is, in a very simplified calculation, it's basically total lifetime costs divided by total lifetime generation. And this brings us to the following numbers. I take all of the numbers in my presentation from the latest EIA energy outlook. This gives us the following numbers. So levelized cost of electricity are usually displayed in US dollar per megawatt hours. And you can see here, for example, natural gas combustion combined cycle, $38, solar 36, wind onshore 40. These are on the lower end. On the higher end, we would have wind offshore. And so what's the problem now? This is a very, a common way to evaluate costs of an investment is basically to have the lifetime cost divided by the lifetime output. And the fundamental misunderstanding here is the following. So if you look at these numbers, you can make following conclusions. For example, that solar is the cheapest source of electricity, and then follow up with the reason there's no transition to solar and wind is that the dispatchable technologies are subsidized. And I'm not taking this quote from somewhere. So the first part was actually, and this inspired my paper, was said in an interview by the leader of the German Green Party, who is now about in the race of becoming the new Chancellor of Germany. So she said it in an interview, and this inspired me to deep dive into the cost evaluation. Because I mean, why are the costs increasing when we include more solar and more wind? Something has to be off here. Something is wrong with the levelized cost, with this way of evaluating the cost of electricity. And the misunderstanding is as follows. So levelized cost of electricity are the costs to generate electricity, to generate electrons, to produce electrons. But electricity markets are quite unique in the sense that the demand has to be equal to supply at every time, at every place. So what should be relevant here is not the cost to generate electricity, but to provide sufficient electricity to meet the demand. And this means that for dispatchable sources, for flexible dispatchable sources, the levelized cost of electricity are somehow a good measure to evaluate the costs to provide electricity, because they can turn them on and off. And we will see later that it's quite, it's a good measure. It's not a perfect measure, but it's a good measure to compare the cost of providing versus generating. But for intermittent sources, they are highly flawed. And that's not just my statement. That's also, among others, Paul Josko pointed out, so many economists pointed this flaw of levelized cost of electricity, that intermittent sources have difficulties to providing electricity. They are good at generating electricity, but that's not really relevant. We don't want to just generate electrons. We want to provide electrons at a certain time, at a certain place. And as I said, the pointing out this problem is, pointing out this flaw is not my doing here. And there has been, a measure has been invented that takes all these issues with evaluating intermittent sources into account, which are the system levelized cost of electricity. System levelized cost of electricity by a really interesting paper by Eckert et al. 2013, very seminal paper in the evaluation of intermittent resources, says, well, for intermittent resources, we have two types of costs. The one are the generation costs, which is the levelized cost of electricity. And then there are the integration costs, the costs associated to intermittent sources of electricity to integrate their output into the grid. And these intermittent costs, integration costs are basically split up into profile costs, balancing costs, and grid costs. So grid costs, what you need in addition for grid expansion, balancing costs, what you need basically to meet supply and demand, and profile costs can be split up into overproduction costs. If wind and solar become, if the share of wind and solar increase, you have more overproduction, full load hour reduction costs, and backup costs, basically the cost that you need because you need backup. And they evaluate in their paper, they evaluate the costs for each share of wind. So for example, and for the same for solar, this graph shows their results for wind. So if the costs for wind, if the share of electricity for wind increases from 0% to, let's say, 40%, the generation costs stay the same. But what increases, and it increases, almost exponentially, are the integration costs, because you have more costs associated to profiling, to balancing, and to grid costs. And what they show in their paper is that starting from 60, these should be lower now, because the paper is a bit old, but what you see that going from a share of 0% to 40%, the costs basically double. And this is, in my opinion, the gold standard of evaluating the intermittency. It has only one fallback, which is that it's not really catchy. It's not, you can't use it in a discussion. You can't say, well, the system levelized cost of electricity of wind are, and then you want one number. No, you have many numbers. You have a number for every share of wind. So I thought maybe we can come up with something that's equally catchy as levelized cost of electricity, meaning one number per market, and that includes the cost of intermittency. And what I thought about is to just take their approach to an extreme and say, how about the entire market has to be supplied by only one technology plus storage? So we say, we take it to an extreme and say, we look at the market and say, how about there's only one technology plus storage? What would it cost us? And I call this new approach the levelized full system cost of electricity, because we look at the full system approach. And what I do is basically solve a minimization problem. So, and I'm not going too much into detail here, but what these conditions and so what the minimization function is basically the minimized costs. Minimized costs are the installed capacity. We install the technology, whatever the technology we're looking at, plus storage. And then we generate at a certain cost and make it conditional on meeting the demand at every time, and not over, basically filling up our storage properly and so on, and also ramping up and ramping down in a certain manner. So this basically gives me, I use hourly data. This gives me a minimization problem with roughly 40,000 site conditions, but it's a semi-definite problem, so we have solvers for it. We can solve it quite quickly. That gives me basically a one-to-one comparison between all the sources of electricity, and also gives me the cost of providing electricity to a certain market. So what are my underlying assumptions? So I use the numbers in my paper, in my work. I use the numbers from EIA, from the EIA Energy Outlook. I say, okay, well, both all technologies have overnight capacity costs and O&M costs in kilowatt per year. And I merged them together using saying that the investment is split over year 1 and 2, and operation goes from year 3 to year 30. Basically, everything, yeah, according to the EIA calculations. And then they say they have variable costs as follows. I allow the dispatchable sources to also use storage in their systems. And we see that nuclear, coal, and biomass will use storage in their optimal, in their cost minimal system, whereas natural gas won't use it. I say that dispatchable technologies can ramp up and ramp down at a rate of plus minus 50% per hour. This is not really relevant because the demand doesn't change that quickly. And it's also so with modern technologies, and I'm using the numbers for modern nuclear as well, for advanced nuclear, they can ramp up and down almost completely within an hour. They shouldn't, that's why I include this, but they can do it technically. And I assume that intermittent sources can perfectly forecast the hourly capacity factor and can dispose electricity. I fixed the storage factor. And when I talk about storage, I say any type of way to store electricity. But I had to define a storage factor, and I fixed it at $3 megawatt hours per megawatt, which is currently the number of a Tesla power battery. But this number is also quite flexible depending on the technology. So for flow batteries, for example, it can be scaled up to 20, 30, whatever. Whereas for lithium ion batteries, it's low, roughly at this level, maybe even a bit lower. And I look at the markets in Germany and Texas, or the ERCOT market, and I use ERCOT and Texas here interchangeably, though it's only it's not exactly the same. And why am I using Germany and Texas? Well, first of all, I have the data, and I have it for 8 years. And also, the markets in Germany and Texas are quite different in many perspectives. First, the demand pattern is vastly different. So the two pictures depict the demand, the maximum and the minimum average daily demand in Germany and in Texas over the 8 years. And we see a bunch of things. First, we see that the German demand is actually quite stable. It goes a bit down in the summer, whereas the demand in Texas is almost 50% lower in the winter than in the summer, the electricity demand. And the reason for this is that both heating and air conditioning is provided by electricity in Texas, whereas in Germany, heating is still mostly natural gas and oil. Then the second point is that the weekend effect is much lower in Texas than in Germany, which is mainly because, again, the air conditioning and so on. Because even if you don't work at the weekend, if you don't work, you use more air conditioning at home, and so on and so on. Also, the demand in Germany is almost roughly half per million people than in Texas. So we have fundamentally different structures of demand that we will see in the levelized full system cost analysis. We can really see that the demand structure must be different. When it comes to capacity factors for wind and solar, Texas is almost, the average capacity factor for wind is almost twice as high Texas than in Germany, and more than twice as high for solar. And it also has a different pattern. So we can see here the dashed line, the dashed line, it's almost constant, a bit lower in the fall for Texas, where in Germany it's significantly lower in the summer than in the winter. The opposite is true in the summer for solar, of course. I mean, German summers are not famous for being sunny, whereas Texas, it goes up in the summer, but it's also quite high in the winter. And these are the input factors. So what I'm doing now is I have 8 years of data. And I can't put all of the 8 years in my optimization problem, because then my system crashes. Because, as I said, with 1 year, 8,760 hours, I have 40,000 site conditions. And if I do 8 years, then I have 40,000 times 8. So it's too much. So what I'm doing is I optimize this system for every year. So I do it 8 times, which gives me 8 different numbers. And then I say, okay, well, then the levelized full system cost is basically the average over these 8 numbers. And what do I get? First of all, I get intervals, as I said, 8 years, which gives me 8 numbers, and then I get an average out of this. And first, that shouldn't surprise people. The interval is much larger for wind and solar than for the dispatchable ones, because wind and solar depend on their capacity factor as well as the demand. The demand doesn't really vary that much, which explains why the interval for the dispatchables are quite low. Then we see that wind and solar are much higher for dispatchable sources. The levelized full system costs for wind and solar are much higher for dispatchable sources than much higher for wind and solar than for dispatchable sources. And especially solar in Germany is exorbitantly high, which again, if you've been to Germany, if you lived in Germany, I am from Germany, it's not a surprise. Germany is not famous for its sunshine, and especially the winter month. There's almost no sunshine in Germany for like a period of 3-4 months. So this explains these high costs if you want to provide the entire system with just with solar. I also included, because the next argument would then be, well, we don't want to provide the entire system with solar. So I included a wind and solar mix. And even the wind and solar mix, which is lower than just wind, of course, even the wind and solar mix is much higher in Germany, or it's much higher both in Germany and in Texas than the highest dispatchable source. Another interesting observation, and that stems from the different demand patterns, is that the levelized full system costs for dispatchable sources are lower in Germany than in Texas. So for intermittent sources, it's higher in Germany than in Texas, which is because of the higher capacity factors in Texas. But the levelized full system costs for dispatchable ones are lower in Germany than in Texas. And this is mainly because of the quite stable demand pattern, which, in Texas, you have a lower overall capacity factor for dispatchable sources, because you need some of them, you need only some of them in the summer, whereas in Germany, you have a much higher capacity factor. So this was the initial analysis. And then I said, okay, what can we do with it now? And I'm going to discuss 3 counterfactuals. The first one is storage losses. So of all the input factors we used, the only one where we are quite sure that where it's quite likely that the costs are going to go down significantly are storage costs. Oh, sorry. No, first of all, this is the second counterfactual. So what if storage costs drop significantly? The first counterfactual is going to be, what if we include storage losses? So far there are no storage losses. We can include this. And the third one would be, what if we say, okay, the source doesn't have full responsibility to meet the market, but only 95% responsibility. So it only has to meet 95% of the demand. And starting with the storage losses, so there are basically 3 situations in a storage cycle where losses can occur. The one are the charging losses. If you charge the battery, you lose, 1 kilowatt goes in to charge the battery, and then it's only like a 0.8 kilowatt in the battery. Then we have discharging losses. If you have 1 kilowatt in the battery, how much can you actually, send to how much actually goes to the grid? And then we have storage depreciation. Over hour, how much electricity do you lose? And we only focus on charging losses and discharging losses here, because our storage cycle ends up being quite short anyway. And what we see here is, first of all, especially for wind and the wind-solar mix, storage losses don't really change the cost. And the main reason for this, the main intuitive reason for this, is that that we have so much overproduction. And either we have the overproduction that is just thrown away, or we lose it in the storage cycle. So once you go above 40%, 50%, even wind and wind plus solar will feel it. But if you stay within a reasonable margin of charging losses or discharging losses, you won't really feel the storage losses for wind and the wind and solar mix, but you feel it for solar. And what you feel for solar is that discharging losses are twice as costly as charging losses. So the cost, the levelized full system cost, would be equal, almost equal for 10% discharging loss, equal to 20% charging loss, which is also can be explained quite intuitively, because costs at the end of a production cycle, which would be the discharging loss, are always more costly than at the beginning of a production cycle. That's the charging losses. So this basically, it supports our assumption that, our initial assumption that we don't include storage losses, because even if we include them, it's not going to change much. Second would be changing the costs for storage. And using the baseline, the number that I showed in the first line, I examine what happens if storage costs drop by up to 95%, which it could be equivalent to a certain degree. A decrease in storage costs are equivalent to an increase in the storage factor. So I said we have 3 MWh per megawatt, but this increasing this is equivalent to up to a certain degree to decreasing the storage costs. And what we see here is that even if the storage costs drop by 95%, the levelized full system cost, the cost of providing electricity in Germany by just this one source, are still higher for the intermittent ones than for the dispatchable ones, for the most expensive dispatchable sources. In Texas, the threshold would be like drop by 85%. So if they drop by 85%, wind and solar, the wind and solar mix becomes more expensive, becomes cheaper than nuclear, but it's still far away from the natural gas combined cycle. And the last but not least, I'm going to talk about the levelized full system cost. Yeah, I call them 95. So what if we only have to supply 95% of the demand by this technology, and the other 5% are just taken over by a source, by some flexible low-cost technology. And first, what we see here is that this reduces the full system cost for the intermittent sources by almost 50%. Same for Texas here. And this is in line with other studies that examine these 100% approaches. So politicians really like to say we want 100% clean energy, 100% wind and solar. And almost all the studies show that if you relax this 100% to 95%, it's roughly, you save 50% of the costs, which really questions the sanity of these 100% approaches. And what we also see is that while the levelized full system costs for dispatchable sources are quite, 15% higher for Texas than for Germany, the difference between the two of them decreases. And this can also be explained quite intuitively by the fact that, you basically flatten the demand curve, and the demand curve is has a much higher peak in Texas. So you flatten the peak, and then you basically flatten the overall annual demand. So that's my idea, to include this intermittency into a catchy number, one number per market. I think we can't get around the market things, because costs are different in different markets, especially for intermittent sources. But it's one approach to include this whole discussion of intermittency, and to actually show that wind and solar are not necessarily the cheapest once they have responsibility to match supply and demand. And this is it. Thanks. I'm looking forward for your questions. And thanks for the attention.
Thank you very much. I really appreciated your presentation and your approach. Do you have some question? Maybe to be okay. I have a question. I have a request, to be more precise. Could you please, just to get a key takeaway, make a recap of your results, because some of them are logical. I really appreciate the fact that you integrate the cost of the intermittency of the renewables, but some of them are not that very intuitive and are coming up like a turn up. So just could you make a recap of your results and the parameters that have to be taken in account in your calculation? And my question is, what does that change in terms of ranking between a traditional LCO calculation, the traditional one, the classical one, and your calculation? Just because it's very interesting to put together, the first ranking, and it has quite an impact. So it's very impressive to your results. So
the main, I would say, the key takeaway is that every time somebody talks about levelized cost of electricity, they make an assumption. And the assumption is that the responsibility of that intermittent sources of electricity have no responsibility to match supply and demand. So if somebody says solar is the cheapest source of electricity, they mean solar is the cheapest source to generate electricity. And that's not something I challenge here. This is, depending on where you are, of course, not in Germany probably, but in Arizona, for example, it is the cheapest way to generate electrons. But generating electricity is not what's relevant. We don't want to just generate electricity. We want to generate electricity at a certain place, which is, I'm ignoring this one here, at a given time, at every time. We want to match supply and demand. And there is a huge markup, a cost markup, once you include this fundamental property of electricity generation into the cost. And levelized cost of electricity do not include this into the cost. They just give you the cost to generate something, but they do not include the this unique property of electricity markets, which is that supply always has to be equal to demand, into the cost. Which makes, and I think this is quite counterintuitive, because the cost evaluation, lifetime cost divided by lifetime production, is used in almost every industry. That's how industries work. That's how they calculate the cost. Oil is the same. It's just lifetime cost divided by lifetime generation. But for oil, it doesn't really matter, because you don't have the time aspect. Maybe you have a day aspect you want it, but not a second aspect. You don't have to match the demand every second. You have to match it every day, every 2, every 3, whatever. So you can do this, but for electricity markets, this timing aspect plays a vital role, an important role. And once you include this, once you include the responsibility to match supply and demand into the calculations, the picture changes completely.
Absolutely.
And what changes is that solar and wind become much more expensive. Right now, in the last 20 years, wind and solar didn't have this responsibility to match supply and demand. They didn't have to. Absolutely. They weren't assigned to this responsibility, and that's completely fine. So they just produced when they were supposed to produce. They have the lowest marginal cost, so that's completely fine.
Yes.
But once they become more relevant for the market, there is a huge markup in terms of costs that if you assign it, if you include it in the cost evaluation to wind and solar, which you should, because the costs only occur because of wind and solar, they become much more expensive. This, and I think this is the main message from me from an environmental perspective. I'm not saying that we should stick to the fossil fuels because they're cheaper and so on. No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that at some point we have to, basically as fast as possible, we have to integrate renewables. But we should be honest and say it's going to be really expensive.
Yes.
And that's fine. We have to do it. We have to do it. But we should be honest and say it's going to be really expensive, because that's what people in the end have to pay. And I think it's a bit of a misinformation saying that solar is the cheapest, because in the end people will feel that the costs are going up, that the cost for energy is going up, while everybody's telling you that solar is the cheapest. No, it's the cheapest as long as it has no responsibility. But once the responsibility kicks in, it's more expensive.
Okay, thank you for your very sound demonstration. That's very interesting, and I couldn't agree more. So thank you very much. Mr. Shatila, do you want? Yes. Do you have a, sorry, you have a question? It's just because, okay, checking the time. Please.
Thank you, Robert. Very interesting presentation. The storage solution which you chose is obviously the lithium-ion batteries, right? So you assume the Tesla batteries.
Yeah, as an input, yeah.
Yeah. Another question on slide 7, I think you showed the intervals for the costs over 80 years in Germany and in Texas. How do these costs measure with respect to the actual prices in the German electricity market or in the American electricity market? Were they higher? Were they lower? Yeah, the producer of electricity or the distributor, were they at loss, or after taking the whole cost of the value chain, or were they making profit?
So the retail prices for consumer retail prices for electricity are $300. Yeah, it's 31 cents per kilowatt, which is $300 per megawatt. So it's right here. But these are the retail prices. So this includes transmission. I excluded transmission here, and yeah, all the includes the all the other costs. Whereas in Texas, they are basically 11. I think I'm paying 11 cents per kilowatt hour. So they're right here. So they're much higher. But again, so right now we have the advantage in both markets, but we are about to lose the advantage. So right now, wind and solar have no responsibility. That makes them cheap. But once they get responsible, once we have to add storage. Storage is actually a really costly thing because it doesn't produce anything. And most of the storage is not used for a year or half a year. Once this jumps in, it gets really expensive.
I have one more question, Robert. When you were doing some sensitivity on the discharging and the charging losses for the storage, did you fix all other assumptions for all the other variables? So it was a deterministic approach, or did you do a Monte Carlo analysis, for example? All variables, a probabilistic approach, I mean.
No, in the graphs, I fixed all the other losses. So I ignored storage depreciation because what I found is that my longest storage cycle is actually 15 days. And for 15 days, which is a bit it contradicts this whole search for a seasonal storage. And I'm also not the only one who found this out, that seasonal storage might not actually be needed in a wind plus solar market because the storage cycles are much shorter. And with a 15-day storage cycle, storage depreciation is actually not a big topic anymore with modern technologies. So I just looked at charging losses and discharging losses. And when I look, this basically fixes says there are no discharging losses, just charging losses, and this is the other way around. I also looked at what if both of them increase, but it's basically a similar story. It's just for the picture I fixed one.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. We are just fitting the timeline, so it's perfect. Mr. Shatila, would you mind to present your slides, if it's okay for you? Okay, thank you.
Let me share my screen.
Sure. Yes, it's perfect. It's perfect. Yeah, please go on, please. It's can see your screen.
The presentation mode.
Yeah. Thank you
Yeah,
everyone, and I'm glad you are joining us today for this session. My name is Suhail Shatila. I'm a senior energy specialist at Arab Petroleum Investments Corporation, APICORP. Today, I wanted to showcase our MENA power investment outlook for the upcoming 5 years. We chose to do that because we wanted to assess the impact of the pandemic during 2020 on the MENA power markets. How did it impact the power demand, the power supply, as well as investments? Looking from a global landscape, the IEA estimates that during 2020, global electricity demand dropped by around 5% in comparison to 2019. And of course, the power demand drop varied across regions, being most severe in the EU at 8.2%. In the MENA region, the average power demand drop was around 2 to 3%. Now that number was very interesting because we thought why the electricity demand drop in MENA was lower than other regions. I will explain that in the next slide. When looking also at the variation in primary energy demand by fuel for power generation, this demonstrated also the resilience of renewables as fossil fuels and nuclear experienced a drop during 2020. Now, to analyze why the electricity power demand drop in the MENA was lower as compared to other regions, what we did is that we assessed the anchor loads in each economy in select MENA countries, which are Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and the UAE. And we looked how much power is being consumed in the residential, commercial, and the industrial sectors. And we did that pre-COVID, so in 2019, and during COVID in 2020. And how did that change? What was striking is that following also a global trend, the residential power demand experienced an increase during COVID at the expense of commercial and industrial power demand, which experienced a drop. This made sense because during 2020, most people were locked at home, working from home, travel bans, so residential power demand increased. However, what's striking is that in the MENA region, residential power demand constitutes around 41% of total power demand. So this increase in residential power demand countered the overall drop in power demand. That's why we saw a 2-3% and not 6, 7, 8% like other regions in the world. So as you can see, residential power demand is 41, industrial sector 21%, commercial 20%, and the remaining 18% network losses and transport and agricultural sector. Now, looking at the other side of the equation, at the power supply, also from a global landscape, the IEA estimates that during 2020, renewables-based generation increased their share from the whole mix to 30%, up 3% from 2019. Of course, MENA is following the same trend, and it is expected that around 3 gigawatts of renewables are to be added this year, and 20 gigawatts to be added over the upcoming 5 years. This will be led by solar PV in the first place and onshore wind additions. What we did in our report also, we analyzed the power generation mix in several MENA countries, and we also saw how did that power supply mix change pre-COVID and during COVID. As you know that in the MENA countries, most power generation depends on natural gas for power generation, as it constitutes more than 90% in several MENA countries such as Egypt, UAE, Algeria, Jordan to a lesser extent. In Morocco, the picture is a bit different because coal is the dominant component for power generation. So what happened during 2020 is that the share of natural gas in the power generation mix dropped in favor of renewables, mainly solar PV, wind, and hydropower. That was noticed in Egypt with a 2% drop of natural gas, 9% in the UAE. In the UAE, there was, it gave share to renewable power sources, solar PV, and the Baraka nuclear power plant, which was operational as of late 2020. And the 5% in the generation mix in Jordan. In addition to analyzing the power supply and the power demand in the MENA region, we also, in our outlooks, we usually analyze what's happening to the power projects and how are the investments being allocated. What we do is that we usually do a 5-year outlook in our reports, and then we do a year-on-year analysis to see how the new outlook compares to the previous outlook. And we do that for all energy sectors, as you can see, for oil, power, gas, and petrochemical. For the power sector specifically, for the 2020-2024 power outlook, this experienced a $114 billion drop in planned investments, which around 33% drop as compared to the previous 5-year outlook, which we did a year before. Now, the main reason behind that is several planned projects shifted to the committed status in 2020. So that's why the share in the planned project dropped. Several countries such as Egypt and Saudi Arabia started to experience more power surplus capacities. So they started to cancel small power projects. And of course, the fiscally distressed countries such as Iran, Iraq, Tunisia, and Lebanon started to cancel power projects as a direct impact of the pandemic. Now we dive more deeper and we see this drop, and the total amount of investments by value, which is around $230 billion, is allocated to the power sector for the upcoming 5 years. How is it being allocated between committed and planned projects? What we mean by committed projects are any projects which are post-FID. Planned projects are any project pre-FID. What's interesting in the power sector that around 2/3 of the investments are allocated to planned projects, and only 1/3 is allocated to a committed status project. We also analyze by value chain. How is that investment allocated by value chain? 88% is allocated for generation, 12% for transmission and distribution. The 12% is a low value in comparison with the global average of 20% for transmission and distribution, especially as the MENA region is pushing in its renewables programs and integrating renewables, which necessitates strengthening transmission and distribution networks, make them more flexible, more robust. So more investment is needed on the T&D side more than the generation side. When looking at the type of generation by fuel type, we see that 43% of power generation projects are allocated for renewables, around 27% for oil and gas for power generation, 15% for nuclear, and 3% for coal projects. Now we also look at the financing, what's happening on the financing scheme. At the end of the day, APICORP is a multilateral development bank. We are an investment bank, so we also look at the financing market, what's happening there in the power sector. So what's happening is that for highly leveraged projects, which are usually financed based on non-recourse or limited recourse financing structure, the debt to equity ratio is more tilted towards the equity side, 60-40 to 80-20 debt to equity range. As for low risk projects, which are backed by strong government payment guarantees, these are usually financed at a more debt tilted to the debt side of the equation, which is 85-15 debt to equity ratio. Two main market developments that happened in the MENA during 2020 in Egypt, as it accelerated the groundwork and the preparation for Al-Dab'a nuclear power plant, 4.8 gigawatt, which is to be developed by Rosatom, the Russian developer. Also, Saudi Arabia chose to financially restructure its national utility company, SEC, with a reclassification of its liabilities, with the cancellation of the government fees, and the adoption of a regulated asset-based model in order to ensure the economic viability of its national utility. Also now in the region, the issue of hydrogen is a hot topic right now. Everyone is talking about hydrogen and whether the MENA can emerge as a competitive player in the hydrogen market. Well, whether it's green hydrogen or blue hydrogen, MENA has a competitive advantage in both. When you are talking about the GCC countries or the North African countries, when it comes to blue hydrogen, These countries have large natural gas resource bases. They can be extracted at very low costs, very competitive. However, the only variable here is the CCUS, the carbon capture and utilization technology, which is still an emerging technology, and there is not until yet a viable business model for that technology. However, the competitiveness of the MENA region to emerge as an export hub for blue hydrogen is the low-cost natural gas and its access to the depleted oil and gas wells, which could be used for storing CO2. As for green hydrogen, also another competitive advantage for the region is that it is able to produce maybe globally the lowest renewable energy sources, reaching 1 cent per kilowatt hour, especially in solar. However, the other variable is the electrolyzers, the scalability of electrolyzers, and the cost of electrolyzers. So until the cost of electrolyzers can flatten with time, the dominant player for the hydrogen landscape will be blue hydrogen, and the market will be export market, since the only market that exists in the MENA region is a very small hydrogen market, gray hydrogen, which is being used as a feedstock for petrochemical and refinery projects. We saw a lot of projects going on, especially in the UAE and Saudi Arabia, in both blue hydrogen and green hydrogen. However, Oman, Kuwait, Egypt, and Morocco are still at the strategy and the roadmap high-level planning. They haven't reached actual realization of projects. In UAE, in 2 weeks or 3 weeks ago, the first green hydrogen plant was operational. There is a plan last year, Saudi Aramco, in collaboration with SABIC and with the help of the Japanese Ministry of Trade, they were able to export 40-ton demonstration shipment of blue ammonia to Japan. So actual projects are happening in Saudi Arabia and the UAE. The key takeaways from our power investment outlook is that from our analysis, the power sector will play a key role and a vital role in the economic recovery for the MENA region post-pandemic. Policy efficiency and digitalization are key factors for shaping the future power markets and the required investments. And MENA has a very high potential for regional interconnectivity among its domestic markets and to emerge as an export hub for net zero and low carbon products such as hydrogen, ammonia, and methanol. This is all what I have. Of course, if you want to get in touch, below are my contact details. And if you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do you have some question? Please raise not your hand, but your voice if you want to.
Yes, I have a question. Thanks a lot for this, for these really interesting insights.
Yes.
I heard, and you mentioned it as well, I heard today in the nuclear section, earlier in the nuclear panel, that UAE is, opened their first nuclear power plant. Was it the first? So what is I was surprised, I didn't know about that. What is the general tendency of the MENA region towards nuclear in the next 10, 15 years? What's your feeling about it?
Yeah, actually the UAE commissioned and the Baraka nuclear power plant, 5.6 gigawatts. Actually, the UAE is moving towards a diversification of its power supply mix and looking at it from an energy security perspective, if you want. So in addition to the Baraka nuclear power plant, they are also commissioning a coal power plant, the Hamraween coal power plant. So the UAE's approach is to diversify its sources of electricity and to reduce the dependency on natural gas, especially that it imports natural gas from its neighbor Qatar. And any geopolitical disruption that happens, these imports are threatened. So that's UAE's perspective. Egypt is also moving towards the Al-Dab'a nuclear power plant. Talks have been with Rosatom for a while. However, the issue with Egypt is it's more geopolitical, so and financing. So the financing, it's around $30 billion, the Baraka nuclear power plant. It has been said that the Russian banks will be able to secure around 25 billion, and the remaining 5 billion has to be secured by the Egyptian government. So also Egypt we saw 90% its dependency on natural gas. So it's looking at it to diversify its power generation mix. Saudi Arabia also and Jordan, in addition to UAE, Egypt, also Saudi Arabia and Jordan are looking at SMRs, small modular reactors, projects smaller in size than that in Egypt or in the UAE. However, still the main, if you want, feeling in the energy landscape in the MENA is the issue of safety, basically. Due to geopolitical uncertainties, due to threats. So having a nuclear power plant raises concerns for safety. However, UAE commenced with that, Egypt is on the way, and Saudi Arabia and Jordan are also seeking basically for two main reasons: diversify the power generation mix and for energy security.
And maybe a follow-up question. What is the discussion on interconnection? So you talked about Morocco is part of MENA and also Saudi Arabia, and I could see this being perfect for diversified solar, because when the sun goes down in Saudi Arabia, it's still like 4 p.m. in Morocco. Is this? I don't know anything about the status, the current status, whether they're interconnected at all, the power markets. What's the status and what's the outlook? Are there any?
Actually, we covered that. I covered that topic in detail in our recent energy investment outlook. Maybe I can send it to you. There's a whole section on MENA interconnectivity. Currently, we have three main regional interconnections. The North African countries are connected together. The GCC countries, they have a grid, and the Levant countries also they have a grid. Power trade between these three hubs have been really modest, maybe below 10% over the years. And it has been done as just in an emergency supply of electricity and not based on the commercial viability, if you want, because of prices. Most of the electricity is being subsidized in the region, and until that subsidy is lifted, the regions can be competitive, the electricity markets, and trading could be done. Actually, also in our outlook, we did a small analysis by we said, okay, if we have a solar PV power plant in Saudi Arabia, in the western side of Saudi Arabia, and the CCGT power plant on the eastern side of Egypt, what could be a more competitive or a least costly option of electricity? Obviously, this is very much related to your presentation. We did an LCOE, a standard LCOE. However, we mentioned that this needs to be fleshed out with the grid level costs in order to get a comprehensive idea of the total cost, basically. There are plans to connect Saudi Arabia with Egypt, 3 gigawatt to 20 kV power line, because of seasonal fluctuation between the countries, which makes it economically viable. Since the peak load at these two countries occur at different times and different months. So it only makes sense to make use of that and to trade electricity between countries. That's one. Especially GCC, if you look at GCC and Levant region, for example, they have even much higher seasonal disparities and the fluctuation. So it makes more sense to also trade with the Levant countries, especially Lebanon and Iraq, which are experiencing power cuts currently. So basically, this is the landscape for the regional connectivity among the MENA countries for now.
But you don't see, just a quick follow-up, you don't see a massive transmission line from Morocco to Saudi Arabia anytime soon?
No, actually, the Morocco trades electricity with the Spain and Portugal, which are much nearer than the GCC countries. So North African countries has an advantage to export energy, not only electricity and hydrogen even, to Europe. So due to the access, and they already have cable connections, undersea and above sea cable connections between Morocco, Spain and Portugal. So, but again, having more regional interconnections, it makes more sense because it reduces reserve margins for countries. And it cuts, the most important thing is that it cuts the investments needed to build the new power plants. So if I'm living in Iraq or in Lebanon, for example, I'm fiscally distressed, Instead of building a new CCGT that will cost me X millions of dollars, I can trade electricity, I can buy electricity from my neighbors, basically. So the advantages of regional interconnectivity are huge, but until subsidies are lifted and the electricity markets, you know, in the MENA are mainly single buyer model markets with PPAs on the generation side. It's not a merchant market. So prices are relatively high to trade from one hub to another.
All right, thanks.
Thank you. I am very impressed by the strong move into renewables, the gas to renewable switching, the investments, and so on. Does that mean that there will be some shortcomings whenever you will have on one side major, huge additional renewables, additional capacities, and lagging investments in infrastructures, as far as I understand? Just like as in China, for instance, when we had almost the same situation. What do you think about it?
Yes, actually, that's a key takeaway from our report is that,
yes,
okay, we are adding a lot of renewable energy projects on the generation side. However, investments should be allocated more on the T&D side, especially that 12% are allocated currently, whereas the global average is 20%. So with the addition of renewables into the grid, without having investments in energy storage and upgrading the networks basically will fail, as it happened in Jordan, as happened in Egypt. The planning has to be done on the whole life cycle, as in Robert's presentation. So on the generation side, in tandem with transmission and distribution side.
Okay.
However, it all goes to the market structure. Basically, national utilities are responsible for the transmission side. Some countries are started to unbundle the distribution side, and the generation side is mostly IPPs, basically signing 20-25 years PPAs. So also the market design plays a role when it comes to that. But of course, we stress that investments in T&D has to increase.
Sure. Thank you very much. Another question? Okay. Thank you very much. It was very, very interesting.
Thank you, Alexandra.
Thank you. Would you mind, Mrs. Torras, would you mind to share your screen and then begin your presentation, if it's okay for you?
Yes, indeed.
Thank you.
So thank you, Alexandra, and I am also happy to be here today on the last day of the IAEE conference. And my presentation today will be a little also about cost, but from the TSO perspective, from the transmission system operator perspective. So I think it is a really nice complement to your presentation, Robert, and I think that your concept that you present, I find it quite interesting. And after you see these numbers, these figures, you will see that it will get more complicated as well. So my presentation is divided into in 5 parts. I mean, I'd like to talk a little bit about the background, but why are we doing why we did this study and the methods that we used. Then we will look into the transmission system costs that we considered for these analyses, together with the system, what we called system indicators of the electricity system. After that, I will show you the benchmark and finalizing with some conclusions and the outlook. First of all, my company, it's a transmission system operator in the south of Germany. That means that we are responsible for the transmission of the electricity, and we serve around 11 million consumers. So as you know, in Europe, the European Commission is driving the full integration of the internal electricity market. And it's doing that with the implementation of a wide range of ambitious regulatory framework. And in the view of that, there are some concerns from different market players, market actors, about some, for instance, the efficient use of interconnectors, high transmission system cost, and increasing volume of loop flows, just to name a few of the critical or more relevant issues that have to be addressed by the transmission, by the TSOs. And in all these discussions, there have been also some suggestions that the current market designs should be adapted to reduce those inefficiencies, just such as a new configuration of the bidding zones in Europe, and some others, some other elements of market design. So one of these discussions that have been taking place are the high system costs in Germany. So in this sense, we think that for when talking about efficiency, you have to also look into the fundamental features of the system in order to try to consider them for making the decisions regarding regulations. So why is that? Because we feel that the specific characteristics of the electricity system have an influence on the complexity, and therefore the monetary efforts required to provide this electricity is expected to be correlated to that complexity. In this case, for this analysis, we compiled cost for relevant activities for the TSOs from 6 European countries: Austria, Germany, Spain, France, Great Britain, and Italy. I would like to mention that these 6 countries, they account for 2/3 of the total EU electricity generation in, for instance, the year 2018. This assessment is based in available public information. This is also an issue that is it's addressed in the paper in depth. It's about the transparency, because I mean there are several papers with modeled cost about the different categories that we will present in the next slide. But the actual cost, I mean, the cost that at the end are paid by the consumer, and there is no transparency, because all this information is published in different platforms, and sometimes it is also not complete. So the costs or the categories that we consider for this analysis are the congestion management, the balancing, and other ancillary services. As you can see, we focus really on the costs incurred directly by the transmission system, without taking into account the grid development and so on. This is not taken into account in this case. So to compare, to make this benchmark, we also look into system indicators like the electricity being fed into the grid, the penetration of weather-dependent renewables or RES, and the CO2 intensity, just to give a clearer view of the efficiency or of the cost incurred by the different systems. After that, we built a benchmark where we put the system cost on the x-axis and the relevant system indicator on the y-axis. For the core TSO activities considered are the congestion management. I mean, just to in case that there is some need for more information, I just like to mention that congestion management is the activities that the TSO has to take or enable when there is not enough transmission or capacity, and there is a mismatch between what the market wants and what it is actually possible with the available transmission capacity. So in order to relieve those congestions or to ensure the security of the reliability of the transmission system, the TSO has to make this management. Balancing, I think it's quite clear. This is the one of the primary responsibilities of a system operator. I mean, this in Germany, in Europe, I think also in the US. And the other ancillary services, we're talking about reactive power, black start capability, and grid losses. In this sense, it is important to know that the scheme for recovering cost for these specific other ancillary services varies across countries. For instance, the grid losses in Germany, for instance, are included in the tariffs, and in Italy they have another scheme where the transmission operator or distribution operator, they have to take those into account, and there is another way to get their money back. So just to name an example. So here, after all, we collect this information from these countries for several years. We see that the level of the cost and in the form of a specific system cost, which is a form to uniformize the cost when we divided them by the amount of electricity generated in the system. So we see, for instance, in Italy, have the highest specific system cost or transmission system cost, and they have remained a little bit constant. And Spain has experienced a high reduction of those costs over the last years, and this has mostly to do with the phase out of one mechanism to ensure a reliability concerning the load sheets for the industry. So they are phasing out that mechanism, which was quite expensive, and that's why we see that there is this development in Spain. In Germany and in Austria, we see a similar development, and that it has to do, of course, that in the until 2018, they built together a bidding zone, and they were certainly connected in several ways, but still, of course, we see France with the lowest specific system costs in this benchmark, and this is related, of course, on the high share of nuclear energy. So we have this picture, but we think, and then this is the we think that this picture doesn't quite reflect the whole picture about the challenges every TSO in their activities, and that's why we propose to use additional system indicators when discussing the TSO's efficiency. Moving on to the next slide. Here I have the electricity generation mix, just to show you how different the different countries are regarding the shares in conventional, in the share in hydro and other renewable energy sources, and wind and solar. So we have here in the electricity generation mix, Spain and Germany have similar shares, but we have to look into the Austria. This hydro share, it's fundamental for them, and in the Great Britain also they have a large, similar to Spain and Germany. And Italy and France, they have still a large share of conventional. Of course, they rely a lot on the nuclear power and coal and gas. So if we go back to the last picture, we saw that the costs are quite similar, although the systems are quite different. And if we see now the installed capacity of the same countries, then we still see how there are certain systems. So using this information, we try to depict, of course, sorry, I forgot. We also look according to the CO2 intensity, which is in view of the climate change goals that are getting even tighter and even more ambitious at the European level. It is, of course, an aspect to consider. And here we see that Germany, although there has been a larger and a significant reduction of the CO2 intensity, still it has the highest CO2 intensity factor among the 6 countries, compared, for instance, with France, due to the nuclear energy, and Austria mostly to the hydro potential, hydro resources. So how we build the graph is just on the X, we have the specific system cost that I showed you before, and on the Y-axis we have the system indicators, and the colors depict that the left upper quadrant shows that this is actually where we want to be. This is the system where you have low specific cost and a higher, well, depending if it's a high REST integration or a high or a lower CO2 intensity factor. This is the area where we want to be, and the further you go from there, then there is, of course, there are many potential to improve in different areas. Looking at the specific system cost and the rest in total generation for the year 2018, we see, of course, that the specific system costs from France are coupled with a share of the rest around 20%, and we have similar costs for Germany, Austria, a little bit higher for Spain, and higher for Italy and Great Britain. But still, we see that in this case, although the share of the in the total generation of RES in Austria and Germany, for instance, different is around 30%, double, the costs are the same or similar. Yeah. So, but when we look at the share, compare the cost to the share of wind and PV, and we saw before with the presentation of Robert that these non-dispatchable resources, they are related to high integration costs. So not only in this case I am presenting the transmission costs, but also other costs that I mean, Robert already mentioned it. And still, the costs are similar in Germany and Austria and Spain, a little bit higher, but still you cannot compete with really cheap nuclear energy from France, which is also CO2 neutral. Yeah, and Italy is also a case that they rely still a lot on the gas and some coal, but the steel, although the integration of the wind and photovoltaic, it is still low, and together with high specific system cost, then we think that this make a better comparison between the different TSOs across the countries. Looking at the CO2 intensity, there is this is another picture, of course, because in this case, Germany has 4 times a higher CO2 intensity as Austria and Spain, or double like Great Britain and Italy, and this is all because of the high dependency still on coal, and I think that has also moved the politics to declare the phase out of coal in Germany until, I mean, at least from the regulatory part until 2038, although meanwhile no one believes anymore that it will take that long to phase out the coal alone because of the market developments, current market developments. Finally, I think what I wanted to show you today and share with you is insight into the cost incurred by the TSOs for some of the core activities. There are other activities, but I think we think that these are the core activities for which there has been so many discussions in Germany, for instance, about the high curtailment cost and redispatch cost. So including additional dimensions concerning the fundamental system characteristics can provide a basis for a more balanced discussion on this area. Also, we see that systems with a large share of wind and solar are paired with system costs or specific system costs, which are comparable to those systems with a lower share. That means that it is a kind of a paradox, because normally you say if you have a higher share of renewables, then you have higher integration costs, higher full system costs. But in some cases, at least for the years that we analyzed, this is comparable to systems with a lower share of renewables or weather-dependent renewables. And considering the operational challenges posed to all systems with the continuous higher penetration of wind and solar, we think that closer collaboration and sharing of best practices can be a crucial element for, yes, achieving the ambitious decarbonization targets, at least in Europe. And with that point, I will bring my presentation to an end. Thank you for your attention. And if anyone has a question, I'll be happy to address it.
Thank you very much. I'm very glad to get your reactions, Suhail and Robert, about this presentation, which comes up with some very counterintuitive results. So I'm very interested to get your opinions, and your questions on this.
So I have a question. Do you expect, so right now the costs per megawatt hour are roughly like $3, €3, €4. I don't remember exactly, at least in Germany, for a 40% share of renewables in the mix, which is, it's higher than the others, but it's still lower compared to the quite low compared to the generation cost. I think it's roughly like 10% of the generation cost. Do you expect this to go to a level where it's really like a large share of the overall costs? So going up to, let's say, 20 euros if the share of renewables increase.
Well, I think that we have to always talk about wholesale prices and the tariff prices, because in Germany we have currently the highest tariffs in Europe. But this is not related to the wholesale prices. I mean, the wholesale prices represent around only 20% of the tariffs. So this, if I go look back.
Yeah, if I recall correctly, like the wholesale prices are around 50 euros in Germany, 50 euros per megawatt hours.
Yeah, currently.
Around this area.
Yeah.
And then, so the specific system costs, are even in Germany 3 euros per megawatt. So like less than 10% of the wholesale price, which
that's correct.
20% of the retail price. Do you expect this to go to grow to a level that it's a significant? Do you expect it to grow up to, let's say, 20 euros per megawatt hours if Germany continues the buildup of?
Okay, that's really depends on the politics. I mean, this is not a lot. It has not a lot to do with the, well, certainly with the physics, with the markets. But in my view, there's a large element on the regulations. That means we are currently, we have these levies for the RES support, and they are a large part. So if the regulations say, well, we will cap that levies, then this contribution will go down. And because why I'm talking about this, because in this cost you see the whole curtailment cost and redispatch cost. This is all included here. So it depends really if the RES levies have been kept, because if not, they will be these costs will be still higher. So this will be right now we have a really interesting discussion, because we, as you know, I mean, we will have another government in the next months. And probably, I mean, the Green Party, it's a really serious candidate, as always. I mean, but those views, we want 100%. Why not 95%, as you said before? Okay, we have to cap these levies or not, or we have to leave it all to the free market. So to answer your question, I do not think that they will go that high. I mean, to go to 20, for instance. But I expect that there will be an increase already. I mean, that this is the data for 2018. And I wanted to present you more with the data for 2019, but one country didn't have the data already out. So I decided to leave it to 2080. But anyway, yes, there will be an increase in the cost, but not to that extent. I would say around 50%, 60% more from the values that we see here. And for instance, in Spain alone, because of the phase out of this load sheet mechanism, which was kind of support for the heavy industry or large industry, it will continue to go down over the next years.
Okay.
Thank you, Sandra. Actually, I had a question on this slide for Spain specifically. So this downward slope from 2015 to 2018, is it due to a drop in the system cost or an increase in energy generated? That's my first question. And how does that relate to the feed-in tariff that I think you mentioned now in Spain, which I think is being cancelled right now?
It's being phased out. I mean, we were talking about they were recurring around 700, 800 megawatts per year for this load sheet mechanism. It came also from the European Commission. There was a notice from the Commission that they thought that this mechanism wasn't really open to all technologies because only large industry could participate in that. So they are phasing it out. I mean, we're talking about I assume that will be around this level in 2019 and 2020. Although I have mixed feelings about it because on the one hand, okay, it was a little bit over designed. Yes, that's correct. On the other hand, this kind of mechanisms, they can help a lot in the case of because of the high volatility of renewables, and Spain has a high share of renewables. So in extreme events, the only thing that can help to balance the system again right now are those loads that you can shed automatically. And if you are aware of this, it happened on January 8th, where we have a large deviation, frequency deviation. There was an issue in East Europe. And in France and Italy, a large amounts, I think there were around 2 gigawatts of load was shed automatically. So, and that's helped the system to recover quite quickly, and it didn't have any a lot of problems with that. So I have a little bit mixed feelings about it. Yes, on the one hand, it was an over design, it was an over procurement. On the other hand, I think that we need right now those mechanisms, and we will need more of them in the future if we are increasing the volatility and the uncertainty in the systems.
And Sandra, the feed-in tariff system. Any idea it's being replaced by? Is it being replaced by a contract for difference, or what type of system is it being replaced?
Again, I didn't get.
The feed-in tariff system in Spain, which is being phased out.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Is it being replaced by something else? Is it being replaced because in other countries it's being replaced by contract for difference, for example, and ensuring the investor a minimum rate of return over a certain number of years in order to incentivize the investments? Is Spain doing the same?
Yes, this is only one mechanism. They have because of their large share. I mean, we can see here the large share of renewables already in the generation mix. Let me see. Yeah, well, almost 40% of the generation mix. So they are already working in other mechanisms. So the problem with this load sheet mechanism was that it was really targeted and it was not open to all kind of technologies. So only already or conventional, already established industries could participate on that and make profit from that. So I think that they are looking in, they are redesigning the whole mechanism, because as I mentioned before, with this high share of renewables, of weather-dependent renewables, you need some tools to maintain the system and to guarantee the reliability of the system.
Thank you.
Thank you. Just to get a recap, what are the challenges that will be experienced by the TSOs in the future, and what are your recommendations regarding the market design? Do you have some opinions about it? What is the most efficient market design regarding the new market conditions?
Yes, when we talk about market design, I would really like to refer to at least in Europe, we have so different systems. I mean, if you look at France, they have a large share of nuclear, and it is dispatchable. So they already have a really good basis. In Austria, they have large hydro potential, so the challenges are quite different. So if I talk alone on Germany, of course, right now in the next years, the phase out of coal and nuclear, those are the most challenging aspects for, at least for Germany. Because although we have, of course, we have interconnectors to the neighboring countries, but we have to remember that when there is a scarcity situation, there is a scarcity situation in the other countries as well. So in those cases, we need a toolbox with different mechanisms, different elements that we can use to react timely in this case. Considering market design, I mean, I mentioned at the beginning, the European internal market, it is growing, is developing. So we have a lot of changes in the market design, in the pipeline for the market design. We will be introducing, for instance, for the markets, we will introduce additional, just to name a few, additional auctions in the intraday market. We will have the 50 minutes time product in the whole yes, in the whole Europe, continental Europe. We are working on the interconnections, strengthen the interconnections in the between countries, but also optimizing the capacity calculation of those to optimize the available capacity. I mean, this is a lot. I mean, we can have another 20 minutes just talking about the whole palette of changes that are coming. I mean, they're already in discussion, not only among the TSOs, but of course the regulators, the DSOs, and of course the member states. Yes, that would be my opinion on that.
Other questions? Do you have some? I'm looking for the audience, the assistants. Okay. So thank you very much. It was very, very interesting. Thank you very much. I propose to complete the session if you're done with that. Of course, we are okay. We are finishing a bit sooner, but as we are not that not in number, we're not a crowd to say the least. I think it's a better thing. Please stay in touch, because that was very nice to meet you, even virtually, but very nice. And I'm very glad and very happy to meet you today, because the content was amazing and very, very interesting. I've learned a lot of things, some of them very, very counterintuitive. So thank you for that. It was very non-prejudicial, so it's very, very interesting.
And by the way, so Suhail, yes? Where are you located, Suhail?
In Saudi Arabia.
Okay, so we got 3 speakers from 3 continents. That's awesome.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I hope to be in touch with you guys. I found your research, your concept quite interesting, Robert. I hope that I can contact you later. Suhail, really interesting. I didn't know a lot about some of these part of the world. So I hope to be in touch. And if you need some inputs about market design in Europe, maybe I can point out the right person.
Okay, thank you very much. Do you know if your tremendous presentations will be made available in some place? Because are they released? Or?
I think so. Yes, we have to share them. Please.
Okay.
Alex.
Yes, gladly.
Yeah, you have all the presentation available on the website.
Okay. Is that okay, Felix? If we, I mean, we're done. If we finish everything at this time.
Yeah, sure. I followed everything. Thank you very much for animating the session. So if it's good for everyone, I may stop the recording and end the session. Is that good?
Yeah.
Thank you all.
Perfect.
Thank you all. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye bye.
Have a nice day.
Have a nice day.